the Gospel of Mark, the crucifixion of Jesus is depicted in such a way that it mirrors something that would have been known to the people who are listening or reading Mark's Gospel. It was mirroring a ceremony which was common in the Roman Empire that was known as the Roman triumph. And originally, a Roman triumph or triumphal procession was a way to honor military heroes and generals who had conquered for the Roman Empire and to put their accomplishments on display for the Roman public. And over time, by about 20 BC, it became exclusively reserved for ceremonies to honor the Roman emperor. In particular, there are some historical records of the coronation ceremony of Roman Emperor Nero in AD 66, though he had been emperor since AD 54. And he was the reigning tyrant of Rome when Mark penned his gospel, sent to Romans under the rule of Nero. And so it's very likely that Mark was writing his gospel to Gentiles living in Rome, and it seems exceedingly likely that his entire intent was to contrast the earthly rule and authority and sovereignty of Roman Emperor Nero with the supernatural rule and authority and sovereignty of King Jesus. And while some historical records differ, there seems to be a general consensus that there were 9 major steps or elements included in a Roman triumph, and in particular the coronation of Nero as emperor, which were depicted in ancient Roman art and sculpture. And it seems that Mark was depicting the crucifixion in such a way that he was intentionally mirroring these 9 steps, so as to say Jesus is the real king. The crucifixion was his enthronement and was his triumph. So now I'm going to give you a disclaimer, all right? If you go home and you try to look this up, you might have a hard time. I spent a lot of time this week making sure I wasn't crazy because I had come across this somewhere and then I was like, I couldn't find it anywhere else. And but it's there. It's in some more obscure scholarly things and kind of far down the nerd path, as you will. But I'm going to take you on that path tonight with me. And I think, if there were just 1 or 2 things that matched up, I'd go, that's just a coincidence. These people are reaching. But I think you'll see with me that it's pretty overwhelming. And so I'll share with you what I found. You can decide for yourself. And so what I'm going to do tonight is list the 9 steps from Nero's Roman triumph coronation ceremony. And as we list each step, we're going to also read straight through Mark's account of the crucifixion and look for those elements in the gospel to see if is this what Mark was doing. So the Roman triumph and the crucifixion. Step 1 for the Roman triumph was that the Praetorian Guard would gather. A cohort of the Praetorian Guard was made up of at least 200 and as many as 600 Roman soldiers who would gather to hail Caesar as Lord and God. And in Mark 15, verse 16, Mark tells us, the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the Praetorium, and called together the whole company, or some translations say cohort, of soldiers. So the Praetorium was the governor's residence where Pontius Pilate lived. And so this could be a coincidental detail, but Mark makes sure to also point out that they called together the whole company, the whole cohort of soldiers. And it seems unusual that an entire company of 200 to 600 men would come out just to mock and abuse a single Jewish prisoner. And I'm not saying it didn't happen, but rather that God can orchestrate events such that they lend themselves to his inspired word. I think God knew what Mark was going to do. He knew the audience that Mark was writing to. And so he set this up so that Mark could use it. And Mark's making the connection to the first step of the Roman triumph. And so it makes sense to include that detail. Second step, the Praetorian Guard would then clothe Caesar in ceremonial dress, typically a purple robe, because purple cloth was expensive. It was emblematic of royalty, and also a crown or a wreath, which would have been made of laurel leaves, much like you may have seen pictures of Olympic champions in ancient Rome or Greece that they would wear for winning a race. So read what comes next in Mark, verses 17 through 20. And I'm not skipping any verses tonight. We're just reading right through Mark. Verses 17 through 20. They dressed Jesus in a purple robe. They twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on him. And they began to salute him. "Hail, King of the Jews." They were hitting him on the head with a stick and spitting on him. Getting down on their knees, they were paying him homage. So again, Mark's gathering these details. They seem a little unusual. In Matthew's account, he says the robe is scarlet, which makes more sense because where are they finding a purple robe unless they borrowed Pilate's? There probably wasn't much purple cloth laying around. That was the color of royalty. So Matthew says scarlet, so probably a Roman soldier's cloak, easier to get a hold of. But Mark makes sure to say, no, it was purple. It's the color of royalty, the color of the Roman triumphal garb. And then the crown of thorns is an ironic nod to the laurel wreath. Then step 3, Caesar would then be led on a procession through the city of Rome, which was lined with altars of incense. And here, every citizen would see the victor and praise him for his triumph. Depictions of his victory would be on flags and banners and signs and monuments. They'd all be displayed as Caesar was paraded through town for all to see. The next verse in Mark, verse 20, says, after they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple robe and they put his own clothes on him. They led him out to crucify him. They led him out. The procession begins. The parade through the city has begun. Fourth step. During this procession, the triumphant Caesar was followed by an animal, which was to be a sacrifice. And frequently, and is the case with Nero's triumph, the animal was a bull. And in every single depiction that we have of Nero's triumph and other Roman triumphs, the bull is never left to walk alone. There was always someone accompanying the bull, and that someone would always be carrying an axe or some other instrument of death that the bull would meet later in the procession. So what does Mark say next? Verse 21. They forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. He was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. In John's account of the crucifixion, he says Jesus carried the cross alone. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include the extra detail of at least some point in the journey, another man, Simon of Cyrene, he gets enlisted to carry the cross. And so again, I don't think it's that Mark made up these details to suit his framework, but rather that he's leveraging the true details to make a point. Here comes a man following the sacrifice, carrying the instrument of death before they arrive on the hill. Step 5, wine with myrrh on a place called Head Hill. The city of Rome is built on 7 hills. On the tallest hill, there was a temple to Zeus, which eventually became the temple to Caesar Augustus. And there was a myth which stated that when they were building that temple, the workers unearthed the head of Romulus, who is said to be the founder of Rome. And so they named the tallest hill Capitoline Hill, because the Latin word capit, meaning head. And so it just simply means head hill. And the Roman triumphal procession, after it winded its way through the city, it ended at Capitoline Hill. Upon arriving at Head Hill, Caesar was then offered wine mixed with myrrh, which was extraordinarily expensive wine reserved only for kings. And instead of drinking the wine, Caesar would pour it out on the altar for the sacrifice to signify that he needed nothing. The sacrifice could proceed. Mark tells us next in verse 22, they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Place of the skull. It's not common for Mark to tell us what something means all the time. But here he goes out of his way to translate for us and say, Golgotha is Hebrew for place of the skull, or really, place of the head. Not an empty skull, a head. So it may not be Capitoline Hill in a literal sense, but Mark doesn't want us to miss this is Head Hill. And then Mark is the only gospel writer who includes the detail about wine mixed with myrrh. All the Gospels, they say other things. Matthew says it was wine mixed with gall or with vinegar. Later in Mark and in other Gospels as well, there's another detail of Jesus being offered sour wine or vinegar wine on a stick. He's on the cross. He says, I'm thirsty. And they give him some sour wine to drink. But Mark is the only one who says Jesus was offered with wine mixed with myrrh before he's crucified. And just like Caesar on Head Hill, Jesus refuses the wine on Golgotha. Step 6. The bull is then sacrificed, after which Caesar would then pronounce death or life on a host of prisoners who had been dragged along in the procession. This was a moment for the emperor to show his power over life and death. They would produce criminals or prisoners of war in front of the crowd, and Caesar would walk among them saying, you live, you die, you die, you live, you live, you die. Just to show his preeminence, his authority over death and life. It's at this point in the story that Mark says in verse 24, then they crucified him and divided his clothes, casting lots for them to decide what each would get. Now it was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge written against him was the King of the Jews. The sacrifice is killed. And just to underline the enthronement motif, Mark reminds us of this charge. King of the Jews. The king. The one who should have authority over life and death is the one dying on the cross. Step 7, the emperor would ascend the steps of the temple with the commander of his armies on his left and the high priest of Rome on his right. And he was lifted up for everyone to see above the crowd. And so Mark tells us in verse 27, they crucified 2 criminals with him, one on his right and one on his left. Why does Mark include that detail? Because he doesn't include any other details about the criminals, right? The other Gospels tell us the story of the thief who repented, and Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. It's the other Gospels who explain how the second thief ridiculed Jesus all the more. There's far more about the criminals next to Jesus in the other Gospels, but Mark shares one detail. They're on his right and on his left. He's evoking the image of those displayed on either side of the enthroned ruler, lifted up for the crowd to see. Step 8, as Caesar was presented at the top of the steps with his high priest and commander of armies, the people would chant, "Hail Caesar, Lord and God." This is the only step that I think doesn't quite fit in order. The next verses in Mark say this. They say those who were passing by were yelling insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! The one who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself by coming down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests with the scribes were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we may see and believe." Even those who were crucified with him taunted him. So here, if you are going to reconcile the Roman triumph with Mark's account, I think the way you can do that is that Mark is aligning the mockery of Jesus with the praise of Caesar. It's an ironic inversion. They mockingly refer to him as the Messiah, the one who was to be their Lord and their God. and they invite him to save himself so they will see and believe. What they don't understand is that by staying on the cross, their Lord and God is doing saving work that they might see and believe. But we'll come back to this step in a moment. Though it's out of order, I think it's still present. Step 9, the final step of the Roman triumph, was that the people watching expected a heavenly sign to confirm the coronation of the emperor as king. Some historians have said that on the day of Nero's coronation, an eclipse occurred. It's likely that astronomers knew when an eclipse would come, and so his coronation was planned accordingly, which is why I think his coronation ceremony was so late after he had already ascended to the throne, right? I told you earlier he was crowned emperor in 66, but had ruled since 54. And here in Mark, we see in verse 33, when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, see, he's calling for Elijah. Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, fixed it on a stick, offered him a drink, and said, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. Then the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So Jesus receives not just one, but 2 heavenly miraculous signs. Right, there's an eclipse or some sort of supernatural darkening of the sun in midday. And then the curtain of the temple tears in two, starting at the top, coming from heaven down to earth. And now this is where I said we'd come back to step 8, because it's after these 2 heavenly signs that Mark concludes by saying, when the centurion who was standing opposite him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. It's out of order, but I don't think it's an accident that Mark points out it was a Roman soldier, a centurion, likely a member of the Praetorian Guard who had begun the day abusing the king who is now on the cross. This soldier says, truly, this man was the Son of God. He really is the King of the Jews. He really has been crowned and enthroned. And even the Romans know it to be true. Their own enthronement ceremony has just been enacted in front of their eyes. Because there's a new king and a new kingdom. And the cross is his throne. Without it, the kingdom doesn't come. Jesus is the triumphant one, and the cross is his victory. So rather than mourn the cross and grieve the death of the king, I want to invite you to celebrate the king enthroned.
Hi, I'm Pastor Rob, and I just want to thank you for joining us online today. And one of the things that we believe here at FCC is that you can't do life alone. And so while we're grateful for the technology that allows us to live stream and archive our services and sermons, the reality is that online pales in comparison to coming in person and being with people and interacting face to face. And so our encouragement to you is that if you're local here, that you would come check us out in person, and we'd love to get to know you and help you get connected here. If you're not local, then our encouragement is that you would find a church near where you are, that you can build relationships there. If you'd like more information about FCC, or you'd like to give online, or you'd like to submit a prayer request, or even let us know that you're coming this Sunday, you can do all that on our website, fortvillechristian.com. We would love to see you here.